In today's video, we're going to go through 3 steps to addressing tensor fasciae latae pain, and I'm going to give you 5 exercises that you can start using right now. Yo, what's up? It's Coach E here from Precision Movement, and today we're going to go through 3 steps to addressing tensor fasciae latae pain. So the tensor fasciae latae is a muscle right at the top and outside of your hip, right here. And it's not very big, it's maybe about that big, and it inserts into your iliotibial band. Okay, so that's the taut band of fascia that runs on the outside of your thigh. Okay, this muscle is often very problematic. People have a lot of pain here. It tends to flare up in people and they don't know what to do. Oftentimes they'll massage, foam roll the IT band, trigger point, static stretch. But the thing is with the tensor fasciae latae, none of these approaches are going to give you lasting relief, because for the majority of people, the tensor fasciae latae is sore as a compensatory mechanism. Okay, the tensor fasciae latae is compensating for muscles, other muscles in the hip that aren't functioning correctly. Okay, now I'm going to go into this very briefly, but if you want the full background, the anatomy, the biomechanics, and the references, definitely check out the article. I'm going to link that in this video here. You'll see a little eye icon on YouTube, and I'm also going to link it at the end of this video, because if you have tensor fasciae latae pain, you're going to want to understand everything fully so you can take the right steps to be rid of it for good. Okay, so the tensor fasciae latae, in terms of biomechanics, it performs 4 movements. Okay, hip flexion, it contributes to hip flexion. Hip internal rotation, so that way, internal rotation. Okay, and hip abduction, so bringing the leg out to the side. Now it also assists in, when the knee is flexed only, tibial external rotation, like that, okay? So rotating the tibia externally. Okay, that doesn't happen when the knee is straight, because all the rotation occurs at the hip in that case. So only when the knee is flexed, tibial external rotation. Because the tensor fasciae latae inserts into the IT band, and the IT band inserts into the lateral aspect of the tibia, the lateral condyle, it rotates it out. Okay, and that's very important to understand when you perform the techniques that we're going to show you. I'm going to show you here today. Okay, so the 3 steps to addressing tensor fasciae latae pain. These 3 steps are part of the precision movement process for eliminating pain and improving mobility. So in all the courses that we offer, hip control, spine control, everything, these 3 steps are followed, because if you don't follow these 3 steps, you're not going to resolve pain long term, and you're not going to improve mobility long term. Okay, you might get some instantaneous acute effects, but then you'll regress back to what you started at. Okay, so step 1 is addressing structural limitations. Step 2 is activation and dissociation, and step 3 is functional integration. And I'm going to go through all these steps and give you exercises for each one. Okay, so let's start with step 1, structural limitations. Structural limitations can be muscle length itself, could be fascial length, or it could be joint capsule mobility, the joint mobility. If you don't address these things first, if you do any dynamic mobility exercises, activation exercises, you're not going to get the results that you're after, because these structural blockages, you can just think of it as, imagine bone on bone. If that's happening, no amount of stretching is going to go through that. You've got to fix what's causing that bone on bone. Okay, same thing happens with the limitations that I mentioned. So one technique that you can use that will help with tensor fasciae latae pain is the 4-point hip joint mobilization. Okay, this hits the joint capsule, and I've got a video, I'll link to it as well, but we'll go through a really quick demonstration of this technique. So you want to get a band. You don't have to do this with a band, but it does help. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to mobilize into internal rotation, because the tensor fasciae latae, like I said, it's a hip internal rotator. So if our joint capsule is limited into internal rotation, the TFL is going to have to fight that much harder, and to no avail. It's going to work harder, but it's not going to be able to do anything because it's bumping up against this joint capsule. So it easily becomes overworked, and that's how the pain develops. Okay, so this is going to mobilize into internal rotation to remove that blockage if it exists for you, okay? So you're in a 4-point stance here, set up, nice spinal alignment, hips shoulder width apart, or hips or knees hip width apart, hands shoulder width apart, and you're going to internally rotate the hip where the band is, the hip that you're working on. Okay, so I internally rotate. Now you can block it if you want. You can throw a dumbbell or a kettlebell down there, but you don't have to, okay? And from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit back, and once I start to feel that restriction, I sit back and I'm starting to feel restricted here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scour. So I'm going to circle my hips around. Your significant others might appreciate this one as well. But you'll circle your hips around 5 to 10 circles in one direction, under control, nice and slow, and then 5 to 10 circles in the other direction. Okay? And what this is doing is just rotating and mobilizing that joint capsule into internal rotation so that if that structural limitation is there, it's going to remove it. Okay? So you do that. That's the 4-point hip joint capsule mobilization. That's a technique that you can do daily. Okay? So that's just one example. There are many techniques that you can do to remove various structural limitations. Okay? So if you have that structural limitation, one thing that you might have heard about is femoral acetabular impingement. This technique is great for that because we're getting rid of that impingement by mobilizing the joint capsule. Okay, so that's step 1, addressing structural limitations. Step 2 is activation and dissociation. Okay, so I said earlier, the tensor fasciae latae is often compensating for other muscles that are not working properly. Okay, so some of these other muscles are the muscles that perform the same actions as the tensor fasciae latae. Hip flexion, which could be the iliopsoas or the rectus femoris, okay? More commonly the iliopsoas. Could be hip internal rotation, okay? Variety of muscles there, but predominantly glute medius and glute minimus, anterior fibers, as well as hip abduction. Okay, so there you have all the glutes, medius, minimus, maximus. All right? So if any of those muscles are not functioning properly, then something else has to pick up the slack because we still got to move, we still got to flex our hips to walk upstairs and to walk in general. So other muscles kick in to compensate. A muscle like the tensor fasciae latae, it'll jump in, it'll help out, but it's so small, it quickly and easily gets overworked, which results in soreness. So it's just like working the biceps. If you're doing bicep curls all day, every day, they're going to get sore, they're not going to recover, and then you're going to have just chronic pain. Okay? So what we've got to do is restore activation first of those other muscles. Okay, so let's say, for example, it's the glute medius. An exercise that I'd prescribe for this would be the side-lying hip abduction. So there's a lot of studies, and that are linked to in the article that I'm sending you as well, but that show what are the best exercises to activate various muscles of the hip and to make sure other muscles aren't working as much. And one is the side-lying hip abduction. So if you've seen Buns of Steel with good old Jane Fonda doing this, but what the studies have shown is internal rotation of the hip activates more glute med relative to TFL. Okay, so if TFL is working too much and glute med is not working enough, this is what we want to do. So internal hip rotation, hold that position, and then it's a slow, controlled lift, abduction. You can hold it for 5 seconds and return under control, okay? And you can poke in the side here. You want to be working a lot here, not so much here. TFL is going to work because it's an abductor, but we want to focus on glutes. So squeeze those glutes, hip abduction, hold it for 5, squeeze it hard, breathe. So we're activating that muscle and down, okay? So this is a very basic activation technique to get the glute medius working, okay? A little tweak that you can do to get glute max, another study has shown how do we get glute max firing without so much TFL? Well, you do the same kind of technique except you flex your hip up to at least 60 degrees and then you do abduction. And that's going to get more glute max involvement as opposed to glute medius involvement with less TFL. Okay, same protocol. do reps, hold for 5 to 10 seconds, okay? So we're activating the muscles, getting them fired up. So if they're sleepy, they're atrophied, they're weak, we need to first activate them and build up their strength and that neuromuscular connection, the mind to muscle connection, so we can use those muscles in other exercises and movements, okay? So there's a couple techniques. Another technique I want to share with you here, activation-wise, actually that one is the monster walk, okay? So the monster walk, you've probably heard of it before, but there's, again, a couple little tweaks. When I dove into the research for this, I saw a lot of studies showing how do we get the best activation, okay? So in the monster walk, traditional monster walk, you put a band around your legs or your feet, your ankles, and you just sidestep, okay? But what the studies have shown is the best band placement to get glute involvement is around the feet, and the hypothesis is, and makes sense, is that facilitates external rotation of the hip because you're fighting that force. The band wants to rotate my hip internally, so now the external rotators have to work, glute max predominantly, okay? And then position-wise, you want to be in an athletic stance, a semi-squat position, okay? So those two tweaks will improve your activation profile, more glutes, less TFL, all right? So you're just stepping, slow steps. I like to slide over kind of like a lateral lunge and then bring the foot back in under control. So slide out, slide over, bring the foot in under control. Step out, place down, shift your body weight over, bring the foot back under control, okay? This way we're not using momentum and we're building strength and control throughout the range of motion, okay? Not throwing the cable or throwing my feet, I'm activating and controlling. All right, so that's a monster walk, anywhere from 8 to 12 repetitions, either way, okay? So that's gonna get glute max, glute med, not so much TFL, which is what we're going for, okay? So those are a couple of exercises of examples for activation, okay? And dissociation, that's a little more complex. Check out the article, I'll break it down more there for you, okay? Finally, step 3, functional integration. Now that we've removed structural limitations, those are out of the way. We've got muscles activated, all the muscles that we need to be working are working, and the movement patterns are broken through dissociation, so we've got conditioned movement patterns just through habit. It's like Pavlov's dogs, you ring the bell and they start salivating. Well, whenever we flex our hips, we tend to dorsiflex the ankle, okay? So one example of dissociation is flex the hip, plantar flex. Okay, that's just a dissociating that movement pattern, breaking that conditioned movement pattern, and that just opens up new levels of activation. It activates muscles differently, and it opens up the variety, the number of movement patterns that we have available to us. Okay, we create new neuromuscular pathways, new neural pathways in our brain, all right? So step 3, functional integration. Now we want to put all that stuff into movements that we actually do in real life. Okay, there's no point just doing activation exercises, then going out and moving, doing, say, a squat, for example, the same way that you'd always squat it. You want to make sure all the other muscles are integrated into that movement pattern. Okay, so a couple techniques that I want to show you. The first one is a unilateral wall squat, and this has been proven in the research to be a very beneficial exercise for glutes and less TFL. So if you've got one side that's affected and the other side's not affected, okay, then you start with your good side and you see, okay, where's that range? And that's the range that you want to get to, okay? So you've got kind of a gauge. So this, my left side is my good side. My right TFL is actually a little overactive, a little facilitated. So the unilateral wall squat, you just make sure your feet are pointing straight ahead, make sure you've got good hip alignment, and then you're sliding down, and then back up. Okay, very simple. And this is just gonna start to train that squat movement pattern, getting the glutes into it. Okay, so if I'm gonna do it with my bad side, what most people will find is when they do it with their bad side, they'll shift over their hip a lot like that to keep balance. Okay, that's because the abductors are not functioning properly. So you gotta make sure the hip doesn't shoot out like that, and think about weight through the ball of the foot and the medial aspect of the heel. and then slide down there, and then up. Okay, you can use your other foot for balance. This would be a low-level functional integration technique because we're using multiple joints, multiple muscle groups, and we're doing patterns that are used in everyday life and sport. Okay, so that's one technique. The second technique is the banded lunge. So the banded lunge is a very popular exercise now, but one thing that I see a lot of people doing mistakenly is using a band that's way too heavy. Okay, all we want to do is make sure we use a band that elicits the right activation pattern. We're not trying to build strength in this, like max strength in this type of movement, because it's not a movement that we do in everyday life. We don't have somebody pushing our knee in as we're doing a lunge, which I'm going to show you. Okay, so use a relatively light band, just enough to get a little bit of activation and to get some kinesthetic awareness of what you're trying to fire up. Okay, you're going to do a lunge, a banded lunge, so step back or banded split squat. Make sure both feet are pointing straight ahead, hips are square, tall, good posture. And you're just going to squat down, lunge down, making sure that everything's tracking in good alignment and going all the way up to full knee extension at the top. Okay, so your focus should be on the medial aspect of the heel, the ball of the foot, and just keep that alignment. Okay, under control, so you build that strength through the full range of motion. And this is going to integrate the glutes and the glute medius and the glute maximus for external rotation and hip abduction into a lunge movement pattern, which is a common movement in the gym, in sport, even in life, going upstairs again. Okay, so that's step 3, functional integration. So these are the 3 steps that you must go through to eliminate tensor fasciae latae pain for good. Okay, because if this muscle is painful, that just means it's overworked. It could be no other reason. It's overworked. It's doing more than it needs to be doing because other muscles are not pulling their weight. Okay, so we've just gone through a really quick kind of high-level overview of the 3-step process, and I've shared a few exercises with you. So if this all makes sense to you, I highly recommend you check out the blog post that's going to be linked at the end, because this thing it's a big one. We're going to go through all of the background, the anatomy, the biomechanics, the scientific studies, the research, and then I'm going to give you what you need to do to deal with that TFL pain, to get rid of it, and to make sure it's gone and stays away. All right, so thanks for checking out this video. Hope it's been helpful for you. See you next time.